It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and the sky had gone the color of old pewter, flat and low and pressing down on everything like a lid. I remember the temperature exactly because I had checked it twice before I left the house. 31 degrees, just barely on the wrong side of freezing, and the gravel in the yard was clicking under my boots with that particular sound it only makes when there is a thin skin of ice holding the stones together. I remember all of that because that was the morning the auction barn sold the last calf out of my herd for $30, and a man I had known most of my life laughed out loud when I told him I was going to build the whole thing back from that one animal. His name was Gerald Pitts, and he had been running cattle on the ridge above my place for going on 30 years. He was not a cruel man. He laughed the way people laugh when they genuinely cannot picture a thing working out, and then he said, $30, and shook his head, and walked away to find his truck. That laugh cost him nothing. It was just an honest sound a man makes when he thinks the math doesn't add up. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? That $30 calf was a Black Angus bull calf, 6 weeks old, undersized, with a left rear leg that tracked slightly wide when he walked. The ringman had to say the price twice, because the crowd thought they had misheard. $30. I was the only bidder. I walked him out to my trailer on a frayed lead rope, and he pulled against it the whole way, which I took as a good sign. Animals that are already finished don't fight the rope. I drove the 14 miles home with the heater blowing and that calf making his opinions known from behind the cab divider, and I thought about my grandmother the entire way. Her name was Cora May, and she had kept cattle on this same ground for 41 years before her hands gave out and she sold the main herd in the spring of 1987. She sold everything except the land, which she left to my mother, who left it to me. 83 acres of creek-bottom pasture, a south-facing slope that got good sun but shed water poorly, and a narrow strip of timber along the eastern fence line that the county tax assessor had been calling worthless since at least 1962. 3 generations of people had tried to run profitable beef cattle on this ground, and 3 generations had found it harder than it looked. The soil was good, but the drainage was wrong, and in a wet spring the low pastures would stand in water long enough to pull the nutrition right out of the grass, and your cattle would spend May and June eating feed you trucked in at a cost that erased whatever the fall market gave you back. My grandmother had known this. She had fought it every year, and she had also, somewhere in the last decade of her working life, begun to figure something out. I did not understand that until I found her record books. I want to be careful about how I describe what those record books were, because they were not dramatic objects. They were 4 standard composition notebooks, black covers, college-ruled pages, the kind you can buy at any drugstore for $1.50. She had kept them in a metal recipe box in the top drawer of the chest in the back bedroom, and they had been sitting in that drawer for 11 years before I opened them. I found them 3 weeks after my mother passed, in the spring of the year I turned 53, while I was going through the house the way you go through a house when someone is gone, and every object has suddenly become a question about what to keep and what to let go. The first 3 notebooks were what you would expect. Dates and weights and feed costs and veterinary bills and sale prices, the kind of record-keeping a careful person does out of habit. The entries were small and precise and written in blue ink that had faded to a grayish lavender. March 14, 1979. Sold 4 steers, average weight 890 pounds, price per hundredweight $48.20, net after commission $171.04. That kind of entry, page after page, year after year. It was the 4th notebook that stopped me. The 4th notebook started in the spring of 1983, and the handwriting in it was smaller and more compressed, like she was trying to fit more thinking into the same amount of space. The first 20 pages were still the usual records. Then on page 22 she had written a single line across the top of the page and underlined it twice, and I read it standing in that back bedroom with the afternoon light coming flat and orange through the curtains, and I read it again, and then I sat down on the edge of the bed and read it a 3rd time. She had written, "The ground is not your problem, it is your instruction. Read it slowly and it will tell you what it wants to carry." I did not know what to do with that for a long time. The rest of the fourth notebook was different from the first three. It was less ledger and more argument, less record and more reasoning. She had been watching the drainage on the low pasture for years, and she had started to map it, not on any formal survey, but in hand-drawn sketches, little diagrams showing where the water came in off the slope and where it pooled, and where it moved when the pool finally got deep enough to find its way to the creek. She had been watching which grasses came back strongest after the standing water receded. She had been noting the weight gains on calves that grazed the recovered pasture in late July against the weight gains on calves that had spent May and June on the drier south-facing ground. And the numbers were not close. The low pasture calves were consistently heavier by August, not slightly heavier, measurably, regularly heavier. Her argument, written out in plain sentences across the last 40 pages of that notebook, was that the drainage problem was not a drainage problem at all. It was a rotation problem. The low pasture needed to be rested completely from about April 15th through the end of June, which was the window when the standing water was doing its work on the soil, depositing silt, cycling nutrients, doing something to the root structure of the native grass that she could not name but could measure in the cattle that ate it afterward. If you kept the cattle off that ground during the wet window and then turned them in on it in late July, after the water had gone and the grass had come back, those cattle gained at a rate that the south-facing ground could not match on its best year. The hard part, she had written, is that you have to watch the other pastures carry the whole load for 2.5 months, and that feels wrong when you are paying taxes on ground that is sitting idle. But it is not idle. It is working. You just cannot see the work it is doing. She had run this rotation for 4 years before her hands failed and she sold. She had never told anyone about it, as far as I could determine, because the results were modest and the method looked like neglect to anyone who did not know what they were watching. If a neighbor drove past in May and saw the low pasture standing in water with no cattle on it, they would think you had given up on that ground. They would not think you were managing it. I put the notebook down and did not pick it up again for 2 years. Part of that was grief, and I will not pretend otherwise. My mother had been gone only a few weeks, and the farm felt enormous in the way places feel enormous when the person who understood them best has left. Part of it was practical. I did not have a herd. I had sold my last cattle 3 years before my mother passed because the cost of trucking and supplemental feed during the wet springs had made the numbers impossible, which was precisely the problem my grandmother had believed she had solved, and I had not yet read her solution. The person I finally talked to about it was my old friend Dottie Slagle, who had grown up 2 farms over and had been running a small sheep operation for the better part of 20 years. Dottie was not a cattle person, but she was a careful thinker, and when I sat across her kitchen table in February and laid the 4th notebook between us and explained what I thought my grandmother had been doing, Dottie did not laugh. She read the relevant pages twice, and then she said, "How long before you would know if it was working?" I said I thought 3 full cycles, 3 full years of the rotation, done correctly with cattle that were on the place long enough to let you track their weight gains properly. She nodded and said, "That is a long time to find out you were wrong." I said yes. She said, "But also a long time to find out you were right." Then she closed the notebook carefully and pushed it back across the table to me and said, "I think you should get a bull calf." That was February. The following October I went to the auction barn and came home with the $30 calf. He was a black Angus, as I said, and the wide-tracking left rear leg corrected itself inside of 3 months, which the veterinarian, a woman named Dr. Kessler, who drove out from the county seat on a Thursday in January, said was consistent with a minor hip imbalance in young animals that resolves as the musculature develops. She said he was structurally sound and that his frame was better than his condition, and that if his condition improved, his frame would carry him somewhere interesting. I wrote that down. Frame better than his condition. That was in January of the first year. I called him Cobb, which had been my grandmother's maiden name, because I thought that was the right thing to do. The rotation plan required me to fence the low pasture separately from the south slope, which it had never been, and that work took me through February and most of March of that first year. 44 posts, 12-gauge wire, a single-strand electric offset along the creek side to discourage the cattle from working the bank. I did the post, setting myself with a rented hydraulic driver that I picked up from the co-op on a Wednesday morning and returned the following Monday. Cost of rental, $112 for 6 days. I bought the wire and hardware for $231 from the farm supply in town. Total fencing cost, $343, which I wrote into a new composition notebook I had started keeping for this purpose. Black cover, college ruled, because it seemed right to use the same kind. Cobb spent his first winter in the small, dry lot behind the barn, on hay I had bought in September for $480, 80 bales at $6 apiece. He grew. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have impressed Gerald Pitts or anyone else who drove past, but steadily, the way a well-framed animal grows when it is getting consistent feed and not being pushed by weather or crowding. By the time the ground softened in late March, he was standing considerably taller, and the wide tracking was entirely gone, and when he moved across the dry lot, he moved the way a bull moves when he knows where he is going. I had purchased 2 bred heifers in November of that first year, both from a small operation 2 counties north, whose owner I trusted. I paid $1,100 for one and $950 for the other, both Black Angus, both due to calve in April. They calved cleanly, one on April 3rd and one on April 9th, both heifers, both healthy. I did not put Cobb with any cattle that first breeding season because he was too young and I wanted his condition to continue improving without the stress of a working season. That was a patient decision and it cost me a year of production. And I want to be clear about that because patience has a price, and that price is real. I turned the 2 cows and their calves onto the south-facing slope in April, and kept the low pasture completely empty from April 15th through the last day of June, exactly as my grandmother had specified. It was the second week of May when Gerald Pitts stopped his truck on the road above the low pasture and looked down at it, and then looked at me where I was mending a section of fence on the upper line, and he said, "You giving up on that bottom ground?" I said, "No, I am resting it." He looked at it for a moment, standing water in the low corner, the grass sparse and pale, no cattle anywhere near it. Then he said, "Looks like a wet mess to me," and put his truck in gear and went on. I went back to mending the fence. On July 2nd, I walked the low pasture for the first time since April. The water had been gone for 3 weeks. The grass had come back in a way I had not expected, thicker and darker than the south slope grass, with a root density you could feel under your boots when you walked, the ground giving slightly under each step the way good ground gives. I pulled 3 grass samples and drove them to the extension office the following week, which was where things got complicated. The extension agent was a man named Hartwell, young, recently out of university, and he was not unkind, but he was precise in the way that recently educated people sometimes are before the ground has had a chance to correct them. He looked at my grass samples and asked me what they were from, and I explained the rotation, the wet window, the rest period, the method. He listened carefully and then he said that the standard recommendation for drainage improvement on pasture ground of this type was subsurface tile installation, which he quoted at somewhere between $1,800 and $2,200 per acre. My low pasture was 11 acres. I did not need to do the arithmetic out loud to know what that number was. He said a rotation-based approach with a wet window rest was not something he had a current recommendation for, and that he would need to see multi-year data before he could say anything useful about it, and that in the meantime, I should be aware of county regulations regarding standing water and vector control, which I should look into. I drove home and sat at the kitchen table for a while. Tile at $2,200 per acre across 11 acres was $24,200. I had spent $343 on fencing and was watching what my grandmother had believed was happening happen, and an educated young man had just told me the professionally approved version of this same outcome cost 70 times more and came with paperwork. I looked up the vector control regulations. I was not in violation of them because the standing water on the low pasture was moving water connected to the drainage pattern of the creek watershed, and therefore classified differently from impounded water. I wrote that down too. That was the summer I started to doubt myself in the serious way. Not the ordinary low-grade doubt that lives in every farming decision, but the kind that wakes you up at 3 in the morning and makes the whole project look like stubbornness dressed up as reasoning. I want to be honest about those nights because they were real and they were frequent, and I think anyone who tells you they did not have them is either not telling the truth or did not care enough about the outcome to be afraid of failing. What I did on the worst of those nights was get up and read the fourth notebook. I read it the way you read something when you need it to hold. I read the page with the underlined line. The ground is not your problem, it is your instruction. Read it slowly and it will tell you what it wants to carry. I read it twice sometimes. Once I read it 3 times and then sat at the table until the light came, and then went out and walked the low pasture in the early morning and stood there for probably 20 minutes, just standing and looking at the grass and the way the light was catching the dew, and I thought, she stood here too. She stood here and read this same ground, and she did not quit. I went back inside and started the morning feeding and did not quit. Cobb went to work in the fall of the second year. I had acquired 4 more heifers over the course of that summer, 2 purchased in June and 2 in August, bringing my total breeding stock to 6 head. The south-facing slope and the dry lot carried them through the wet window. The low pasture took them in late July and held them through mid-September, and I weighed every animal at turnout and again at the end of the grazing period on the low ground, using a rented portable scale that I had borrowed from Dottie's neighbor down the road, a man named Carl Weems who kept sheep and was generous with equipment. The average daily gain on the low pasture in that second summer was 2 pounds and 1/10 per day. The south slope figures from the same animals during May and June had run 1 pound and 6/10 per day. That is not a subtle difference. That is a difference that changes your cost per pound of gain, which changes what you can afford to spend on your inputs, which changes whether or not the whole operation is viable. I wrote those numbers down, and then I called Dottie and read them to her over the phone, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your grandmother was right." I said, "I know." She said, "How long has she been right?" I said, "At least 40 years. Neither of us said anything for a moment after that. Cobb's first calf crop arrived the following April. 6 calves, 4 bulls, and 2 heifers. Dottie came over to look at them the week after the last one arrived, and she stood at the fence and looked for a long time without saying anything, and then she said, "That is a well-made calf." She said it about each of the 6, one by one, and each time she said it the same way, not with enthusiasm, just as an observation. A well-made calf. They were, by any fair measure, consistently structured animals, heavier than their birth weight suggested they should be at weaning, with the same strong frames their father carried. The third summer's low pasture rotation ran the same as the second. The gains held. I had begun to see a pattern in the grass itself, in the way certain areas of the low pasture were recovering with more density each year, as though the wet window was building something in the soil incrementally, the way a good habit builds something in a person. The dark green band along the creekside fence expanded about 4 feet between the second and third year. I measured it. 4 feet and 3 inches. I wrote it down. In the fall of the third year, Cobb's yearling bulls went to market. I had retained the 2 heifers for breeding replacements. Of the 4 yearling bulls, 2 went through a production sale where they were bought by operations in the next county. 1 was purchased privately by a man named Decker, who ran a small seed stock herd and who had heard about the calves through Carl Weems, and 1 I sold at the auction barn, the same barn where I had bought Cobb 3 years earlier for $30. That bull sold for $940. I will say that once more. $940. From the same ring where his father had been sold at 30. I did not say anything about that to anyone except Dottie, and all I said to Dottie was, $940. She said, "That will do." I said yes. The following spring I got a call from the University Extension Service, not from Hartwell, who had moved on to a different office, but from a woman named Dr. Abrams, who was doing applied research on low-input pasture management systems in creek bottom environments. Someone had mentioned my rotation to her. I never found out who, and she wanted to come and look at the low pasture. I said she was welcome to. She arrived on a Thursday morning in April, alone, driving a university truck with soil sampling equipment in the bed. She was thorough and quiet, and she did not make small talk. She walked the low pasture for nearly 2 hours with a soil probe and a refractometer and a yellow legal pad, taking samples in a grid pattern and writing numbers down in columns. She walked the south-facing slope and did the same. She asked me to explain the rotation in detail, and I explained it. And then I gave her the 4th notebook and let her read the relevant pages, and I watched her face while she read them, and she read them the way you read something when it is saying something you did not expect. When she finished, she handed the notebook back to me, and she said, "How long has this rotation been running on this specific ground?" I told her about my 3 years, and then told her about my grandmother's 4 years in the 1980s. She made a note. She said, "The soil organic matter in the low quadrants of this pasture is substantially elevated above what the surrounding land class would predict, and the root architecture of the cool season grasses in the creek bottom band is more developed than anything I have sampled in a comparable system managed conventionally." She said, "I cannot account for all of it with 3 years of data." I said, "What if it is more like 7 years of data, with an 11-year interruption?" She looked at me for a moment and then looked down at her legal pad and made another note and said, "That would help explain what I am seeing." She did not say I was right. She said what the instruments said, which was that the ground was doing something that the instruments could measure, but that the conventional drainage management prescription would not have predicted. I thought that was a fair and honest thing to say, and I respected her for saying only what she could back up. Her report, which she sent me a copy of 4 months later, described the low pasture rotation system in precise technical language, and noted its apparent agronomic effectiveness, and recommended it as a subject for further study in creek bottom pasture systems across the region. In the acknowledgments section, she noted that the system had been developed and first documented by a producer on this land beginning in the early 1980s. She spelled my grandmother's name correctly because I had made sure she had it in writing, Cora May. Gerald Pitts came by in November of that year. He had driven past the low pasture enough times by then to have seen the cattle on it in late summer and to have had, I assumed, some of the same conversations that farmers have when they are watching something they initially dismissed appear to be working. He stopped his truck at the end of my lane, and we talked over the hood of it for a few minutes. He asked about the rotation, and I explained it briefly. The wet window, the rest period, the grass recovery, the gain numbers. He listened without interrupting, which was different from how he had listened 3 years before. When I finished, he looked out at the low pasture, which was empty and brown in the November light, resting for the winter. He said, "I always thought that bottom ground was wasted on this place. I did not say anything." He said, "I was wrong about that." Then he said he had to get going and got in his truck and went. I stood in the lane for a minute after he drove away. That is all the vindication the thing needed, and I knew it, and I let it sit. Cobb was 6 years old by the time the 4th generation of his calves hit the ground, and by then the bloodline had moved into 3 other herds in the county through his sons, 2 of whom had won production sale premiums that put them in the top third of their class, without anyone making any particular fuss about it. His daughters in my own herd were producing calves that weaned off the low pasture at weights that made the cost per pound calculation look like a different kind of farming than what 3 generations of my family had struggled with on this same ground. The total investment in Cobb from the $30 purchase price through 6 years of record keeping amounted to figures I had tracked carefully in my composition notebooks, which by then filled a shelf in the same chest of drawers where my grandmother's notebooks had waited. Feed, veterinary care, fencing, the rented scale, the rented post driver, the 2 purchased heifers, the 4 subsequent purchases, the hay for 6 winters. I want to be precise about this, so I will tell you the 5-year cumulative net, meaning what came in from sales minus what went out in documented costs, was positive by $11,240 at the end of year 5. That is not a rich outcome. That is a viable one, on ground that 3 generations of careful people had been unable to make viable using the conventional approach. $11,240 means the method worked. It does not mean anyone got wealthy. It means the ground finally got to carry what it had been asking to carry all along. I put a clean label on the front of my first composition notebook, the one I had started the winter I brought Cobb home, and I wrote my name and the dates, and below that I wrote my grandmother's name and the dates of her notebooks, and below that I wrote the line she had underlined twice. The ground is not your problem, it is your instruction. Read it slowly and it will tell you what it wants to carry. I drove to the county agricultural library the following spring and donated a copy of all 5 of my notebooks, photocopied and bound, along with photocopied pages from my grandmother's 4 notebooks, the relevant sections, the rotation maps, the gain records. I asked that they be shelved together and labeled with both our names, and they were. I went and looked at them on the shelf one time, just to see them there, and then I went home and did the afternoon feeding. Dottie called me that evening and asked how it had gone, and I said it had gone fine, that the books were on the shelf. She said, "How do you feel?" I said I felt like my grandmother had been waiting a long time for someone to finish what she started, and that I was glad it had been me. Dottie said that sounded about right. We talked for a few more minutes, and then I said good night and hung up the phone, and went and stood on the porch for a while in the dark, listening to the creek. The ground is not your problem, it is your instruction. Read it slowly, and it will tell you what it wants to carry. I have thought about that line more times than I can count over the past 6 years, and every time I think I have gotten all the meaning out of it, the ground finds a way to show me I missed something. That is the nature of it. The instruction does not end. You just keep reading. If you have a piece of ground that has been giving you the same trouble for longer than it seems like it should, or an old method written down somewhere that never got a fair test, or a notebook in a drawer you have not opened yet, I would be glad to hear about it in the comments. Sometimes the answer has already been written down. It just needed someone patient enough to read it slowly.